Hi, folks. You've made it to the last video in this module, which is good because as you can see, it has fallen dark outside my house. So it seems like the right time to wrap this up. But in this video, I actually want you to or in this page, I want you to digest the information in a slightly different order than I've asked you to do for the other pages. I want you to start by reading the text below this video, which outlines how conflict can corrode, sustain, or rebuild trust. I think it's pretty clear in showing how conflict can function in relationships between two people to corrode, sustain, or rebuild trust. And then I want you to read the assignment from Bernard Mayer about power. You read a different chunk of that chapter in a previous video. And now I want you to read the last 13 pages of this chapter, which is about how sometimes if you're helping a group work through a conflict, or you are in a conflict yourself, that you don't want to start by trying to manage the conflict. First, you want to start by building enough power that you can get another party to take you seriously. I think as you read through the content today, you'll see why that is so important. Because sometimes to get people to come to the table and negotiate with you in good faith, first you have to get their attention. You have to have a big enough carrot or stick. And then once you get them to the table, sometimes they're amenable to moral arguments and to reasonable concerns and to taking seriously somebody else's position just because it is convincing and not because you can force them to pay attention. But sometimes you got to get them to the table first, and they have to be sort of jarred into paying attention by seeing how much influence that one party has in their lives. Anyway, Bernard Mayer makes that point, and I think it will be helpful to y'all. So read that essay and then come back and listen to this video, and then fill out the last 3 questions on your worksheet for the trust and conflict module. So pause this video, go do those things, and then come back. Okay, I'm going to assume that you have paused. So what I want to circle back to in this video is the 4 ways that is the way that default trust can be corroded or built up in those same 4 places that we discussed in the last video about interpersonal trust. So default trust, remember, is the sense that there are shared rules, they're legitimate, everybody will be held accountable to them, and that my concerns about their legitimacy or lack thereof will be taken, everyone's concerns about the legitimacy of the rules will be taken seriously. Now, that default trust can break down in exactly the same places that interpersonal trust can. It might be the case that the norms, the rules that we're all supposed to be operating by are not clear. And this often happens as a result of 2 or more cultures coming together, or just being there are people who are in the organization who didn't grow up with the same education or the same they didn't grow up in the same country, or they just didn't grow up in the same class status as a lot of the people who are calling the shots in the organization. So for instance, if you think about country club etiquette, there's a lot of rules about which fork you use and where you put your napkin and where the water glass goes, and how you hold a conversation, what volume you speak at. All of those are implicit rules. No one says what they are out loud. And then in white collar work settings, a lot of people who have been raised in settings where they were exposed to these implicit rules of country clubs, but also white collar workplaces, they know how to do them just right away. But if you are intentional in hiring in ways that bring people from a bunch of different backgrounds into the same company, not everybody's going to know all those social rules. So you might just need to make the rules for what to dress, what time people show up from work, how loud to talk at work, what kind of language and subject matter is is acceptable at work. You might need to make all of those explicit, which can be uncomfortable. People get really awkward talking about explicit rules. But if you don't, there's no possible way that everybody will feel a sense of default trust of like, oh, I know what the rules are and they're legitimate and we're all going to be held to the same standards. Okay, so you have for default trust to be in place, everybody needs to know what the often unstated expectations are. Likewise, the default trust can break down when there's not normative agreement about those rules. Like, for instance, in a workplace that is somewhat old-fashioned, then let's say there are rules about our working from home or working from home when your children are sick, as opposed to working from home just when you are sick. And the rules were established when you can take PTO, when you can't take PTO. Those rules were established by people who were primary breadwinners and not particularly responsible for childcare. So let's say those rules were established in an era where it was mostly men in the workforce and women mostly did childcare. Well, it might be clear, everybody might know those rules, but you could still have trust breakdown if people feel like that's an unfair rule. It works for some people, it doesn't work for others. We have normative disagreement about whether that rule should be in place. And conflict can be used to renegotiate that or to reinscribe it, or or something else. Like, you might come to some agreement that you reach when you hear the obstacles challenged. But in any case, like, normative disagreement works with regard to default trust as it does to interpersonal trust. Empowerment, it's often the case in organizations that there's a gap between what people are responsible to do and what they actually have the resources and authority to do. So let's say, for instance, this is a very basic example, but let's say that your cleaning staff is responsible for making sure that every floor gets vacuumed once a month, but there aren't enough vacuums to go around. There aren't enough. They get moved from one building to another and no one knows where they are, and they get locked in closets and kind of get lost. And so people are responsible for vacuuming, but like, they don't have the basic equipment they need to do the job, right? So and then other people are frustrated because they thought their office was going to get cleaned and it didn't, and they're feeling kind of uncomfortable and things feel just kind of grungy, and that feels sort of degrading and disrespectful, right? Like, that can be a source of conflict, and also something that healthy conflict could address, but it will degrade the sense of like, I can rely on others in this organization. And then last but not least, motivation. So motivation is very complicated, but it's closely related to things like normative disagreement or agreement and empowerment. So if you feel like rules aren't very legitimate, you usually don't want to follow them. But you also, this gets to empowerment, you also might not want to follow rules because they're just very, very difficult and you're worn out, and you, like, let's say that there's a rule that you work 40 hours a week. Reasonable, but you've been burnt out from COVID and childcare and crushing student debt, which has you working 2 additional jobs. It's going to be hard to fulfill that expectation. So, and you're going to feel you will materially struggle to put in all the hours, but you will also feel very tired and like you don't care a whole lot. So motivation tends to be intertwined with these other concerns. But if you have, a burnt out workforce, that also is going to leave everybody, and then everyone is kind of dropping balls left and right. That's going to leave everybody with a sense that they can't rely on others. And also that everybody is too tired to take anybody else's concerns seriously, which makes for an environment that is less than equitable and less than inclusive, insofar as inclusivity is about making sure that everybody feels like their concerns matter and that their concerns will be taken seriously simply because they have them. It's not always to say that their concerns will rule, that their preferences will rule the day, but moral relationships are fundamentally about this sense that we are accountable to each other, that we have to hear each other out, that it matters what you think, that your judgments about what we should and shouldn't do deserve to be taken seriously. In any case, default trust breaks down and can be rebuilt in exactly the same places that relational trust can break down and be rebuilt. And conflict is a way of intervening at each of those 4 spots. And with that, you've made it to the last video, and I will see you in an asynchronous session soon. Take care.